The record was stamped with a time of death. Not a being's death, a planet's. Counselor Vethsaron found it buried in the morning's administrative queue, a single notation from the Compliance Bureau, filed between a trade dispute and a pest control authorization for a mining station in the outer bands. 7 words in the standard notation format, clinical and unhurried, the way you might note that a shipment had been delayed or a form had been filed incorrectly. The notation read, human population expected to reach compliance threshold within 18 cycles. Vethsaron had been processing council documentation for 63 years. She had seen extinction orders before. She had never seen one that made her pause. Something about the word expected bothered her. Every other extinction notation in the Bureau's archives used the word scheduled. Scheduled implied certainty, implied the target had been assessed, found incapable of meaningful resistance, and the outcome was merely a matter of waiting. But expected was a different word. Expected implied that something had been taken into account that could not be fully controlled. She flagged it, added it to her personal review queue, and moved on to the trade dispute. She would think about that notation for the rest of her life. 3 months earlier, in the administrative language of the Council, the classification of Earth had been simple: Category 7 inhabited world, pre-coalescence, non-spacefaring, no recorded contact with galactic civilization, no strategic resource value sufficient to justify integration cost. The summary recommendation from the Expansion Bureau had been equally simple. Earth fell within the growth corridor of Hegemony Faction 12. Under Territorial Consolidation, Protocol 7 Alpha, worlds in growth corridors that failed to meet integration thresholds within 90 cycles were flagged for voluntary compliance facilitation, a phrase that had been refined over 300 years of bureaucratic effort to mean absolutely nothing to anyone who hadn't read the underlying statutes, and everything imaginable to anyone who had. Humanity had not read the underlying statutes. Humanity had not known the statutes existed. The first thing Fleet Commander Doricvi noticed when his reconnaissance vessel entered the Sol system was the radio noise. Not the content. He wouldn't have the translation matrices for weeks yet, but the sheer volume of it. The humans were broadcasting in every direction simultaneously, at every frequency, with an enthusiasm that suggested either a civilization in a state of constant emergency or one that had never considered the possibility that something in the dark might be listening. There, loud, his communications officer, Felanost, said from her station, removing one of her auditory receptors from the feed after approximately 4 seconds of direct exposure. "Document it," Doricvi said. "All of it. A sample." She sampled 3 minutes of the noise and then sat very still for a moment. "Commander," she said carefully, "they appear to be broadcasting entertainment. In all directions, continuously." "Yes, sir." Doricvi made a note: pre-coalescent species, unaware of exposure risk, no tactical discipline in communication protocols. He underlined that last part because it was the first of 3 things about humanity that he would underline before he'd finished his initial survey, each one confirming the same fundamental assessment. These were a young species, an unguarded species. A species that had not yet learned that the universe rewarded caution, because it had not yet met anything in the universe worth being cautious about. He marked Earth for the Compliance Bureau's attention and moved on to the rest of the system survey. He was already planning what he would do after this assignment. The compliance facilitation of a Category 7 world was not work that demanded his full attention. The second thing Doricvi noticed, and this one he did not immediately know how to classify, was the debris field. It orbited Earth in a dense, disorganized shell, thousands of artificial objects, most of them inert in varying states of decay. At first he assumed it was evidence of some ancient catastrophe, perhaps a moon destroyed in an industrial accident or the remnants of an orbital war fought so long ago it had passed out of cultural memory. But the materials were wrong for that. The debris was too recent, too deliberately constructed. And there were signals, faint but alive, from certain objects within the cloud, suggesting they were still in use. "What are these?" he asked Felenost. She had been studying them for 20 minutes. "They're satellites," she said. "Communications infrastructure, navigation aids, scientific instruments. Some of them appear to be," she paused, recalibrating her translation of the data, weather observation platforms. Doric Vi stared at the screen. The debris field surrounded the planet like a halo of broken machinery, the functional objects threaded between the dead ones, the whole system operating with a kind of cheerful disregard for efficiency that he found vaguely disturbing. They built in their own orbital plane, without clearing the construction waste. It appears they built sequentially over a very short period, and simply didn't stop to clean up between projects. How short a period? Perhaps 70 years, from first orbital object to current density. 70 years. Doric Vi pulled up the Council's standard development timeline for pre-coalescent species. 70 years of continuous orbital construction was not anomalous in itself. But 70 years from first orbital object to this density. Thousands of objects, multiple functional systems, a genuine if cluttered infrastructure, was a rate of development that sat at the outer edge of what the Council's models considered possible for a species without prior contact with spacefaring civilization. He made another note. Then he looked at the planet below the debris field. There were 7 billion of them down there, maybe more. The most recent survey numbers were 18 months old. He was not concerned. 7 billion pre-coalescent beings with no understanding of the threat they were facing posed no meaningful resistance challenge. The protocol was clear. 90 cycles of compliance facilitation, during which the species was presented with the Council's integration framework, the benefits thereof, and the consequences of non-compliance. Most species accepted within 30 cycles. A handful held out to 60. Compliance at the 90-cycle mark was, in the Bureau's historical record, universal. The mechanism of compliance varied, but the outcome did not. What Doric Vi did not ask himself, what no one at the Council had ever asked, because the question had never been necessary, was what happened to a species that didn't read the same historical record he did. A species that didn't know the outcome was supposed to be universal. A species that had never lost before, and therefore had no memory of what losing felt like, and therefore had no instinct for recognizing when it had already begun. First contact happened on a Tuesday. The humans called it that. The Council's calendar didn't divide time that way, but the detail made it into the first contact report, noted by the junior analyst assigned to the Earth file as a local curiosity. Analyst Esra Valom was 22 years into her career, assigned to Category 7 worlds specifically, because the work was considered intellectually undemanding, and she had a gift for the tedious accuracy the Bureau required. She was not, by her own assessment, someone whose opinion mattered. She filed reports. Other people made decisions. That was how the Council worked, and she had never had cause to question it. She would, before this was over, have cause to question almost everything. The first contact itself was unremarkable. A Council envoy vessel, a broadcast in 72 known languages on the humans' own communication frequencies, a formal declaration of the Galactic Council's existence, authority, and the terms of integration. Standard protocol. Efficient. The kind of thing the Bureau had done so many times that the communication templates were pre-written and required only the insertion of the local species name. What was not standard was the response time. Most species took between 4 and 18 cycles to respond to a first contact declaration. The time was understood as necessary. The species needed to absorb the reality of what they'd been told, navigate whatever political structures governed their civilization, and reach a consensus sufficient to formulate a reply. 4 cycles was considered quick. 18 was expected for a species with complex internal political divisions. Humanity responded in 11 hours. Esra, reading the response file when it arrived in her queue, assumed there had been a translation error. She ran the timestamp twice. 11 hours. She pulled up the communication log and found that the response had been transmitted from no fewer than 7 different sources simultaneously, in 6 different human languages, with considerable variation in tone and content between the versions, but with one element consistent across all of them. The answer was no. Not asterisk no, we need more time to consider asterisk. Not asterisk no, please clarify the terms. Not even the careful diplomatic formulations that more sophisticated pre-coalescent species sometimes produced. The answer was asterisk no asterisk in the way a closed door is no. Simple, load-bearing, requiring no elaboration. Esra flagged it as anomalous, attached a note that said requires senior review asterisk, and sent it up the chain. The senior review team received the flag, discussed it for approximately 3 minutes, and ruled it a cultural miscommunication, a failure of the translation matrix to accurately convey the procedural nature of the integration offer, which was not actually an offer in the legal sense but a notification. The response was therefore not a refusal but a misunderstanding. Standard protocol for misunderstanding cases was to rebroadcast the declaration with additional clarificatory material, which the senior team did. Humanity responded in 4 hours this time. The answer was still no, more emphatically no. There were, by Esra count, 43 separate responses in the second wave, from sources ranging across the entire planet. The variation in language was wider this time. The consistency in meaning was absolute. They understood, she said aloud in the empty office. No one was there to hear her, but she wrote it in her personal notes, with the date and the time, because something about the certainty in those 43 responses made her want a record of the moment she first understood that this was not going to go the way it was supposed to go. She didn't know yet what it was going to do instead. Neither, she realized, did anyone in the Bureau. Doric Vi was recalled from his preliminary survey of the outer system and assigned to the Compliance Facilitation Command. The appointment was not considered prestigious. In the Council's institutional understanding, compliance facilitation of a Category 7 world was an administrative function that happened to require a military vessel's presence as a visual aid. The actual compliance was achieved through resource interdiction, communication suppression, and the gradual demonstration of the Council's capacity to make life on the target world uncomfortable in specific, calibrated ways that stopped well short of anything the Ethics Council would need to review. The humans in Doric Vi's professional assessment were not going to be a problem. The word asterisk no was psychologically understandable from a species that didn't yet grasp the scale of what it was dealing with. Once they grasped the scale, the word would change. It always did. He began the interdiction sequence. The first step was communication suppression, a dampening field that progressively degraded the humans' own orbital infrastructure, particularly the satellites. Within 6 cycles, their global communication networks began to show significant interference. Their navigation systems degraded. Their weather prediction capability dropped. The things they relied on that lived in the space above their world started to fail in ways they couldn't fully explain because they couldn't see what was causing it. Doric Vi monitored the situation from the outer system and waited for the distress signals that would precede the request for negotiation. The distress signals came. That was expected. What happened after the distress signals was not. Esra was the one who caught it, because she was the one watching the communication data. 3 cycles into the interdiction, when human satellite infrastructure had degraded by approximately 40%, she noticed something strange in the data pattern. The human's communication volume hadn't dropped proportionally to the infrastructure degradation. It had dropped by a much smaller margin. She ran the analysis twice. Then she called the senior review team. "They're compensating," she said, when she had someone on the line. "Clarify. Their communication volume should be down approximately 40% based on satellite loss. It's down 11. They're routing through." She checked the data again: ground-based systems, physical lines, older broadcast infrastructure, things that don't depend on the satellites. There was a pause on the line. "They have redundant systems. They appear to have built their entire communication infrastructure with multiple redundant pathways, including some that are," she hesitated because the numbers seemed wrong, "several decades old, still functional, still in use." Another pause. Why would a civilization maintain infrastructure from several decades ago alongside modern systems? "I don't know," Esravalom said. And then, because she had been thinking about it for the past hour, "unless they built it that way deliberately, unless they built redundancy in because they do not have the intelligence awareness to anticipate a hostile interdiction," the senior voice said firmly. "They were not aware of us before first contact. This is coincidence of legacy infrastructure." "Yes," Esravalom said, "probably." She flagged it in her personal notes. Legacy infrastructure, coincidence, probably. She did not believe it. By Cycle 9, the interdiction had achieved 68% satellite degradation, and human communication volume had dropped by 20%. The gap, the space between what should have been suppressed and what was actually happening, was Esravalom's constant obsession. She had started pulling every piece of data she could find about human infrastructure, human history, human engineering decisions over the past century, building a picture that was not in any of the Bureau's briefing documents because no one had thought to compile it. What she found was this: for as long as humanity had been building things, it had been building them for a universe that was trying to take those things away. Not this universe, not the Galactic Council. They hadn't known about those. They'd built for storms, for earthquakes, for wars among themselves, a continuous, grinding, creative adaptation to a planet that was genuinely hostile to their survival in ways that most inhabited worlds in Council space were not. Earth was a world of tectonic violence and atmospheric extremes and biological threats that had spent 4 billion years evolving alongside the thing those threats were trying to eat. Humanity had not evolved in safety. Humanity had evolved in a system that was, by any reasonable galactic standard, extremely trying to kill them, all the time without stopping. And they'd stayed, and they'd built, and every time the planet took something away, they'd built it again, slightly differently with one more backup. She was beginning to understand why the notation had said *expected, instead of scheduled. "Commander HFY," she typed, drafting a message she was not certain she had the seniority to send. "I believe the Bureau's compliance model may be applying incorrect baseline assumptions to this species. Requesting authorization to submit a revised assessment." His response came back in half a cycle. "Assessment noted. Proceed with standard protocol. Compliance threshold projections remain within acceptable variance." She stared at that response for a long time. Then she went back to her data. The humans had, she discovered, a word for the practice of imagining everything that could go wrong with a system before you built it. They had developed formal methodologies for this practice. They taught it in their engineering schools. They applied it to bridges and aircraft and medical devices and power plants. They called it failure mode analysis, and they had been doing it, in one form or another, since the first time one of their ancestors built a shelter and a storm knocked it down. A species that had been practicing failure mode analysis for 10,000 years had built, without knowing it, exactly the infrastructure you would build if you knew someone was going to try to take it apart. HFY increased the interdiction intensity. Cycle 12, 79% satellite degradation. Human communication volume, down 23%. The gap was getting wider, not smaller, wider. What happened on Cycle 14 was the first thing that made HFY genuinely pause. He had escalated to secondary interdiction measures, resource interdiction at the orbital trade level, which for a non-spacefaring species translated to degradation of certain electromagnetic systems that their surface infrastructure depended on. Minor, calibrated, the kind of pressure that, historically, began to produce negotiation requests. Instead, his long-range sensors picked up launches. Not weapons. The humans didn't have anything in their current technological inventory that could reach his vessel's position, and he knew it. These were, he had Felenost analyzed them for 2 full hours before she came back with an answer. Replacement satellites, she said. They're launching replacement satellites. For the degraded ones. Yes, but also, she pulled up the trajectory data. Some of them appear to be different designs, not identical replacements, modified. The signals they're transmitting are, I need more time to fully analyze, but it looks like they've changed the frequency architecture. HFY looked at the launch data. In the 2 cycles since he'd escalated the interdiction, the humans had designed, built, and launched replacement satellites. And not copies, variations. They adapted, he said. Yes, sir. In 2 cycles. Yes, sir. He made a note. He almost wrote asterisk concerning. He wrote asterisk anomalous instead, because he was a commander of the Galactic Council, and the word asterisk concerning asterisk implied a category. 7 species had produced something worth being concerned about, and that was not how these things worked. He knew how these things worked. But he increased the interdiction again. And then he called Esra, not because he decided her assessment had merit, because something about the gap in the communication suppression data was staying in the back of his mind in a way that documentation wasn't resolving. Your revised assessment, he said when she was on the line. Give me the core of it in 2 minutes. She didn't hesitate. She'd been waiting. They don't model for survival. They model for continuation after failure. They don't ask, can we survive this? They ask, what do we do after we don't survive this? The difference in behavior under pressure is significant. Explain. A species that models for survival treats a threat as a problem with a threshold. Either we can hold until the threat ends, or we can't. A species that models for continuation treats a threat as a given. They're not asking if they'll lose systems. They're asking which systems they'll lose and what they build after. They're not resistant to damage, Commander. They've been practicing recovery their entire civilizational history. A long silence on the line. That doesn't change the compliance projection, HFY said. No, she agreed, it probably doesn't. She still didn't believe that, and now she suspected neither did he. Cycle 22. The internal record of what happened on Cycle 22 was sealed by the Compliance Bureau for 40 years. Esra found it by accident, decades later, while working on an unrelated file, a timestamp discrepancy in a routine status report that led her down a chain of cross-references to a document that should have been destroyed and wasn't, because someone in the Bureau's records department had made a filing error, and the record had been mislabeled and stored with a batch of non-sensitive agricultural policy documents from a sector 3,000 light-years away. What the record showed was a communication. Not from the Council to Earth, from Earth to the Council. It had come in on Cycle 22, transmitted on a frequency the Council's standard monitoring system wasn't watching. Because it was a frequency, the Council's own equipment used for internal maintenance calibration. The humans had somehow, in 22 cycles, with degraded satellite infrastructure and a partially suppressed communication network, identified a pattern in the Council's equipment emissions, isolated the maintenance frequency, and used it to transmit a message that went directly into the Council's internal communication architecture, bypassing the Bureau's monitoring entirely. The message had been received by 17 Council stations before anyone understood what they were looking at. The message said, "We know what you are. We know what you're doing. We're not going to stop. And we want you to understand something before this goes further. We've ended things before. Things much older than us and much more certain of the outcome." Esra Valam read that message at her desk on a quiet morning, 40 years after it was sent, and felt something move through her that she spent a long time trying to name. It wasn't fear, exactly. It wasn't awe. It was something closer to the feeling of standing at the edge of something vast, and suddenly understanding that the ground you're standing on is not solid. She pulled the rest of the sealed file. There was a notation, written in the hand of the Bureau's director at the time, stamped 7 hours after the message was received. Do not acknowledge, do not escalate response, reassess timeline. The compliance deadline had been quietly extended by 30 cycles. The Bureau had never explained why. The extension had been filed under a different case reference number, making it difficult to trace to the Earth file without the exact document chain she was currently holding. The official compliance projection hadn't changed. Someone had been frightened. Someone had looked at that message and made a quiet, careful decision to buy more time. And they had told no one. Dorikvai's command log, Cycle 29, contained 3 entries that the sealed file also included. The first 2 were routine: interdiction status, sensor maintenance, a crew health report. The third was different in tone, and it was the one that had clearly bothered the official who'd initially reviewed it, because there was a handwritten annotation in the margin: "Do not distribute to wider Bureau." The log entry read, "I have been in Fleet Command for 41 years. I have overseen compliance facilitation of 11 worlds. I have never before found myself trying to determine whether a target species is afraid of us. They should be. They have every objective reason to be. Our capability advantage is total. They cannot touch our vessels. They cannot survive a direct confrontation. And yet, I find myself unable to identify fear in their response patterns. I find escalating coordination. I find adaptation cycles running at rates I cannot fully account for with the technology profile we've attributed to them. I find messages that should not exist. I find what I find most difficult to file in a standard report is this: I am beginning to suspect they are not behaving this way because they believe they can win. I am beginning to suspect they are behaving this way regardless of whether they believe they can win. And I do not have a compliance model for that. Esra Valam read that entry 3 times. Regardless of whether they believe they can win. She had spent 40 years in the Bureau working with statistical models that assumed all sentient species performed a rational cost-benefit analysis under existential threat. It was the foundation of the entire compliance framework. You increased the cost. The species reached a rational threshold. The threshold produced compliance. It was not cruelty. It was mechanics. But mechanics required a lever. And a lever required that the thing you were pushing cared about the cost in a way that produced movement in the direction of your force. What if it didn't? She opened a new document and began to write a formal assessment. Not the kind she filed for routine case reviews. The kind she had never written in 40 years because it had never been necessary. She titled it, Foundational Model Error in Category 7 Compliance Framework, Case Study Earth. She was 62 years into her career, 2 years from retirement. She had never done anything that mattered. She typed for 6 hours without stopping. The turning point, the moment the Bureau would later be forced to acknowledge, though the full acknowledgement wouldn't come until after the director's death, happened on Cycle 61. By Cycle 61, the interdiction had been running for longer than any Category 7 compliance operation in Council history. The standard upper bound was 40 cycles. Earth was at 61, and the compliance probability index, The Bureau's internal metric for the likelihood of a species reaching the threshold was lower than it had been at Cycle 5. It had been going down, slowly and then faster for the past 30 cycles. Doric Vi's replacement. He had requested reassignment at Cycle 40, citing personal reasons, which the Bureau had granted without investigating closely, was a commander named HFY, younger and more confident, and deeply certain that the problem was one of insufficient escalation. She had proposed a set of direct demonstration measures that fell within the ethical framework's gray areas. The Bureau had approved 3 of them. The demonstrations had produced an unexpected result. Not compliance, the opposite of compliance. The Council's sociologists, reviewing the data afterward, would describe what happened as an * cohesion event, a moment in which a fragmented, internally divided species suddenly consolidated around a single point of shared identity. Humanity had, by any reasonable external measure, approximately 600 significant ongoing internal conflicts: political, territorial, ideological, economic, generational. The Council's compliance model relied on those divisions. A divided species was easier to pressure because you could make the cost fall unevenly. An uneven cost created internal pressure to resolve the conflict by accepting the external terms. The demonstrations, which the Council had intended to show humanity the depth of the capability gap, had instead given humanity something they had apparently not had in living memory: a common enemy. They unified, HFY reported to the Bureau, and the flatness in her voice was something the analysts reviewing the communication file would note repeatedly. She was not someone who sounded flat. She was not that type of commander. The communication intercepts over the last 4 cycles show a 47% increase in cross-factional cooperation. Their internal conflict indices have dropped across every metric we track. A pause, I need to be direct with you. I was briefed that the demonstration measures would increase compliance pressure. They have instead increased resistance coherence. I am recommending an immediate operational review. The Bureau Director, the one who would later be found to have suppressed the Cycle 22 message, responded in writing: proceed with escalation protocol as planned. Species cohesion events are temporary stress responses. Historical data confirms reversion to baseline within 10 to 15 cycles. Maintain course. HFY's response is not in the official record. Valom found it in the personal files, the ones that weren't supposed to exist. 3 words, written and then apparently deleted, and then somehow preserved in the document revision history. He's wrong again. Cycle 68. The humans launched something that wasn't a satellite. It took Felanost, still at her communications post, still the most perceptive analyst on the vessel despite having requested transfer twice and been denied both times, 4 hours to fully classify what she was seeing. When she brought the analysis to HFY, she set the data tablet on the commander's desk and then stood in the doorway as if she wasn't sure whether to stay in the room. What is this? HFY said. They're calling it, Felanost checked the translation, a deep space relay. It's a communications buoy, designed to function beyond the range of the interdiction field. HFY looked up. They've been under communication suppression for 68 cycles. Yes. They built this under suppression conditions, with degraded infrastructure. They appear to have been building it in pieces over approximately 20 cycles, camouflaged in the debris field as non-functional legacy objects. The signal activation only became detectable at close range because of the new monitoring profile you requested. Felanost hesitated. It's transmitting outward, away from Council space. To what? A silence that lasted long enough to feel like an answer, even before the words came. We don't know, Felanost said. There's nothing out there on our charts. HFY stood up slowly. They've been hiding an active construction project in the debris field we dismissed as legacy waste for 20 cycles, while under active interdiction, while maintaining a unified resistance posture, while running adaptation cycles on satellite infrastructure, while managing 60-plus active internal conflicts. She paused. And now they're transmitting something into empty space. Yes, they want us to find this. Felinos blinked. Commander. If they hid it for 20 cycles, they can hide it for 20 more. They activated it now because they want us to know it exists. They want us asking what it's transmitting to. Heskvir sat back down. Her voice was very controlled. This is a message, not a communication relay. A message. They're telling us there's a variable we can't account for. They're telling us they have a card we haven't seen. She picked up her comm. Get me the bureau director and send commander-level encryption on this call. Nobody hears this. The call lasted 2 hours and 30 minutes. The bureau's record of it shows a transcript of approximately 40 minutes. Esra Valam spent 3 weeks cross-referencing the timeline gaps against the station's energy consumption records before she found the evidence that the full call had been recorded and then selectively archived, the missing sections routed to the director's personal files, which had been destroyed at his death. She never found what was said in those missing 2 hours. But she found what happened in the 11 cycles immediately after the call. She found it in the logistics records, in the supply orders, in the fleet deployment schedules that didn't quite line up with the official mission narratives. The interdiction fleet had been reinforced, quietly. 7 additional vessels transferred from operations in 3 different sectors under cover of routine rotation schedules. The official file showed 5 vessels. She found evidence of 7. They were afraid. Not of humanity's technology, not of humanity's military capacity. They were afraid of something they couldn't quantify, the variable, the card, the thing being transmitted into empty space. And they were afraid of the part of humanity that had been building that transmitter for 20 cycles under suppression, piece by piece, in secret, without stopping, without giving any outward sign that it existed. They were afraid of a species that could keep a secret while shouting. The cost came on cycle 74. It is the part of the record that the Bureau made the most effort to contain, not because of what the humans did, but because of what it revealed about the Council's own assumptions. The cost was not a battle. There was no battle, not in any form that the Council's military doctrine would recognize as such. What happened on Cycle 74 was smaller than a battle and more consequential than any the Council had fought in 300 years. The deep space relay made contact. Not with empty space, with a human vessel. Not a military vessel. Not anything the Council had in its intelligence picture of Earth's technological capacity, because the intelligence picture of Earth's technological capacity was, Esra Valam would later demonstrate in her formal assessment, based entirely on what humanity had chosen to show. What they hadn't shown, what they'd been building, quietly, in facilities that looked from orbital observation like agricultural structures, using materials that appeared in customs documentation as components for water treatment systems, was a propulsion platform. Small, fragile, running on principles the Council's engineers found innovative in a way that several of them, reviewing the data privately, found difficult to fully discuss without the conversation becoming uncomfortable. Crewed by 3 humans. One of them was 24 years old. The relay contact was brief. The technical data was minimal. What the Bureau's analysts found when they decoded the signal, and Esra Valam, who was one of those analysts, never forgot this, was not a military communication. It was not a request for reinforcement. It was not a threat. It was a recording. A human, voice slightly unsteady, speaking directly to whatever was listening. The translation matrix, which by then had 68 cycles of human language data to work with, rendered it with high confidence. If you're hearing this, you know we made it. You know what that means. We don't need you to do anything. We just needed you to know we're here, that we got out, that you can't box us in. You can take the planet apart down to the last rock and we will still be somewhere you aren't. This isn't the part where we ask you to stop. This is the part where we tell you it doesn't matter if you don't. The 24-year-old's name was in the signal metadata. HFY's communications team flagged it, not because it was significant to the interdiction in any tactical sense, but because of what came immediately after the recording, a list of names, all of them human, 47 names. "What is this?" the analyst asked Felanost. She looked at it for a long time. She had spent 74 cycles studying human communication patterns, and she understood what she was looking at before she could make herself say it. "The crew is 3, she said. "These are the other 44, the ones who were involved in building this, the ones who didn't come." The analyst stared at the list. "They're nomming they're dead," Felanost said very quietly. "They built that vessel for longer than we've known about it, and some of them didn't survive to see it launch, and they sent their names anyway. They wanted someone to know." In the room that had gone very still, nobody spoke for a moment. "Commander," the analyst said finally. "I know," HFY said. "What do we do?" HFY looked at the list of 47 names and the trajectory data showing a fragile human vessel moving through space it had no right to have reached. She thought about the maintenance frequency message on cycle 22. She thought about the satellites rebuilt in 2 cycles. She thought about the 20-cycle construction project hidden in the debris field. She thought about Doric Vi's log entry and the word he couldn't bring himself to write. Regardless of whether they believe they can win. "Call the Bureau," she said. "Tell them," she stopped. "Tell them I'm submitting a formal recommendation to suspend the compliance operation. The director won't approve it." "I know." She looked at the trajectory data one more time. "Tell them I'm submitting it anyway, and tell them to read Analyst Esravalam's full assessment before they respond, both attachments. The director hasn't requested. Tell them." There was a silence, the kind of silence that happens when something is ending. "Yes, Commander." The Bureau suspended the compliance operation on Cycle 79. The official reason cited was operational resource reallocation in the Expansion Bureau's Eastern Corridor, which was technically accurate and entirely misleading, in the way that institutional language becomes when institutions need to make decisions that their frameworks have no honest words for. The decision was not reviewed publicly for 17 years. When it was reviewed, the review committee's final report used a phrase that Esravalam had written in her formal assessment, and that had apparently been quoted enough times in internal deliberations that it had survived into the official documentation. The compliance framework assumes a species that maximizes survival probability. This species appears to maximize something else. We do not yet have the theoretical model to describe the alternative. The operational consequences of this gap are. And then a page was missing. The review committee's lead author had died before the report was finalized, and whoever completed it had made a choice to leave the gap, unfilled, in the final version, as if the absence of words was the most accurate possible way to convey what had been found. Esravalam retired on Cycle 80. She was 64 years into her career. She had filed approximately 40,000 reports. She kept none of them. She kept the personal notes, the document with the date and the time and the word asterisk expected asterisk, the timestamp on the 11-hour response, the analysis of the gap in the communication suppression data, the list of 47 names. She kept those because they were the real record, not the official one. 14 years after the suspension, a council sociologist named Vethorin, no relation to Esravalam's old colleague Vethsaron, though they worked in the same building, published a paper in the Journal of Galactic Civilizational Studies that would later be considered the foundational document of what became known as the human exceptionalism debate. The paper was not about military capability. It was not about technological development. It was 7,000 words long, and it ended with a question that the journal had initially wanted him to remove, and that he had refused to remove, and that had ultimately been the reason the paper was accepted rather than rejected, because the editor had read it 3 times and each time came away unable to answer it. The question was this: every other species we have encountered under sufficient pressure reaches a threshold at which continuation becomes irrational. We have built an entire institutional framework on the assumption that this threshold is universal. The humans reached this threshold at approximately cycle 15 of the Earth compliance operation. Our data confirms this. Their strategic position was objectively hopeless. Their resource base was degraded. Their infrastructure was compromised. The rational outcome at that threshold, for any species whose survival calculus functions as we have always assumed, is negotiation, then acceptance, then integration. Instead, they built a transmitter in secret for 20 cycles and sent a 24-year-old into space in a vessel made from materials we classified as water treatment components. We do not have a model for this. And I want to ask the question clearly, because I think we have been avoiding it. Is the threshold universal, or did we simply never encounter a species for whom the threshold does not function as a threshold? Because for them, it is not the end of rational decision-making. It is the beginning of a different kind of decision-making that our models have no language for. And if it is the latter, if there exists species for which the point beyond all rational hope is not a ceiling but a floor, what does that mean for every compliance framework, every integration model, every strategic assumption the Council has built over 300 years? What does it mean that we met one, and it was the loudest, least cautious, most cluttered, most chaotic civilization in this sector of the galaxy, broadcasting in all directions, filling its own orbital plane with debris, sending its names into empty space, and that all of that, every piece of it, was not the sign of a primitive species unaware of its own vulnerability, but of a species that had decided, somewhere deep in the part of its history we never looked at closely enough, that it would rather be found than be safe. The paper was read by every member of the Galactic Council within 18 months of publication. The compliance framework was formally suspended for Category 7 worlds 2 years later. It was never reinstated. Not because of fear, exactly. Not because of military capability or technological parity or any of the things that had always been the currency of power in the Council's long history, but because the Council, for the first time in 3 centuries, had encountered a civilization that didn't negotiate from a position of strength or a position of weakness. A civilization that negotiated from a position of continuation, which was something entirely different, something the Council had no framework for, something that made every calculation feel unstable in a way that was very hard to name and very impossible to dismiss. Because continuation is not a strategy, continuation is not a bluff, continuation is not a display of capability designed to deter. Continuation is a promise. And somewhere in the debris field above a loud, cluttered, endlessly broadcasting planet, in the records of 47 names transmitted into the dark from a vessel made of repurposed water treatment components, the Council had finally understood what humanity had been saying since the first 11-hour response to the first contact declaration, that they were not asking whether they could win. They had never been asking that. They had been asking something the Council didn't have a word for, in any of its 72 known languages. The closest translation, Felanost had written in her final mission report, before she requested transfer for the 3rd time and was finally approved, was this: how long are you willing to keep going? And the answer that had never changed, not on cycle 1, not on cycle 79, not in the message on the maintenance frequency, not in the names sent into empty space, was the answer that made the Galactic Council, for the first time in its long and certain history, not sure it wanted to know.